Alrighty, we are live on Facebook.
Hi, everybody. I know that we still have a number of people who are coming on, but I wanted to respect your time. Plus, we have a great panel and a lot to cover by getting started right away. We want to welcome all of you to Silicon Valley at Home's Affordable Housing Month Policy Series panel on innovative government actions. I really appreciate you joining us. My name is Leslie Corselia, and I'm Executive Director of SV at Home. We're really excited to have you here for Affordable Housing Month, which has over 50 different events and activities that highlight the important work of SV at Home and our community partners, who we have all listed here on this slide. Everybody is working hard on housing issues across Santa Clara County. This year's theme is Silicon Valley is Home, and it's dedicated to our community. Whether our families have lived here for generations or are just settling in, Silicon Valley is where we live, and we want all our neighbors to have access to safe, stable, and affordable homes. There's no better time to solidify your houser status, you can support the critical work of SV at Home by becoming a member or a supporter, and we have the information on this slide. The link can also be found in the chat. We want to highlight all of our wonderful sponsors who make Affordable Housing Month possible, including our title sponsors, Google, Microsoft, and LinkedIn, and many other very important sponsors and supporters of our work. A reminder to all participants that we would like you to be kind and courteous to our speakers, and please stay on mute unless you are speaking. Before we begin, we'd also like to highlight several elected officials and their representatives who are joining us today. Alex Kobayashi from the Office of Senator Josh Becker, Rocky Fernandez from the Office of Senator Bob Wachowski, Cupertino Councilmember Hung Wei, Gilroy Councilmember Rebecca Armendariz, Gilroy Councilmember Zach Hilton, and Mountain View Vice Mayor Lucas Ramirez. If we missed any elected officials or staff, would you please identify yourself in the chat and let us know you're here. And with that, I'm going to introduce Tamika Moss, who's the CEO of All Home and our event moderator. Tamika is an amazing person in this region, and she's done so much for us. She created All Home, which she can tell you about what its goal is, but it is already in just a very, very short time proving to be a power horse in the Bay Area in responding to the needs of not just our homeless, but our most vulnerable families who are housing insecure and at risk of homelessness here in the Bay Area. Tamika is going to provide an overview of the content, and let's just get started. Thank you, Tamika, for being here.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to moderate this important discussion today. Welcome to everyone who's joining us. It's really a pleasure to be in conversation with leaders who do this work every day, and certainly support SV at Home and all of our work across the state. So I'm really excited to be here with you all today. As Leslie mentioned, my name is Tamika Moss, and I am the founder and CEO of All Home. We are a regional organization working across the 9-county Bay Area to really elevate regional solutions that help us all address homelessness, the cycle of poverty, and housing insecurity across the region. We also recognize that this work is really specific in who it's impacting. So addressing racial disparities as we do this work and really targeting our interventions for folks who are most impacted is critical, as well as paying attention to the folks who are most at risk of homelessness. So all of our community members who are earning 0 to 30% of the area median income are susceptible to housing insecurity and homelessness, particularly in the pandemic era. And so I'm really excited to be having this discussion to talk about innovation in government and how do we take action as we define the future of housing in Silicon Valley. I actually won't spend a ton of time in my framing remarks because I want to get us into the discussion, but I think it's having worked in the public sector for a good number of years in my own career, we don't actually think of government in the innovation space. And yet we have 3 stellar panel members who are doing that work every single day. And in the context of innovation, government has to be able to meet communities where they are and be agile and adaptable, particularly now when our needs have evolved. And so I'm thrilled that we not only have state leadership in Assembly Member Lee and State Senator Wiener, but we also have federal leadership for the first time in decades. The Biden-Harris administration has demonstrated that they not only care about these issues, but they're willing to invest in these issues and help jurisdictions across the nation figure out how to disrupt the cycles of homelessness and housing security. And so I am just, again, honored to be in conversation with our state leaders, as well as Daniel Saver, who is our Assistant Director of Housing and Local Planning at MTC. And being able to think about these issues from a regional perspective and a state perspective is critically important. So I'm going to get us started with the first question. And Senator Wiener, I'm going to direct it at you. How are you? I'm hoping that you've joined us.
I'm here.
There you are. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So, I've had the pleasure of working with you for many years now, and your leadership at the state on challenging the state to reimagine density and how we do housing policy has been, in my opinion, transformative leadership. So I would love to kind of kick us off with a question for you around how are you imagining this state surplus in the context of what we need to do as a state with respect to housing and homelessness?
Well, I think there's a lot that can happen with the state surplus, especially since we, when you look at what is a temporary major surplus, obviously we're not going to continue to have this level of surplus. There's a big push to focus on one-time expenditures so that if the budget is not good in a few years, we don't have to make as many painful cuts. And it's always a push and pull we have in the budget. But when it comes to housing, that's a strength, because even though there's obviously ongoing needs, if we want to have a permanent ramp up of like homeless services, we can make a lot of one-time investments in new housing, whether for formerly homeless people or just low-income subsidized housing in general. And there are so many projects that need gap funding. There are projects that we can get going with Project Home Key. So I think that's really the focus. And the governor proposed $12 billion around homelessness. A bunch of that is for housing. I think there will be some other housing funding as well. I was really thrilled that one of my priorities this year has been securing a significant new fund for housing for our most at-risk youth. And we were asking for $100 million, and there's $200 million in the governor's May revise budget proposal, which we were thrilled about. So I think having those kind of one-time housing investments are important. We do need to keep pushing for the ongoing support, of course, but we have a real opportunity this year.
That's great. And I forgot to mention to the audience, if you do have questions as we continue in this conversation, please put those questions in the chat and we'll spend the last 10 to 15 minutes of our discussion answering those questions. Assemblymember Lee, I'd like to pose the same question to you. How are you thinking about the budget surplus with respect to these issues? I know that in your first term, you came out swinging with a bold proposal around social housing. Talk to us about your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd have to agree with Senator Scott Wiener that, right now it is a great boon to the housing movement, where obviously our temporary surplus in the billions, in the high billions right now, is good for capital expenses, or figuring out how we can invest in our infrastructure level. And at that level, proposals like mine of social housing can have a profound benefit of that, because I think it's demonstrated by this governor's budget. There are multiple billion-dollar proposals related to housing, whether it be Project Roomkey, student housing at the college level, demonstrated investments that we could put into housing, and that can also be translated later on into social housing. Because what we hope to do is, and I'm a big believer in the all options and above to solve our housing crisis. And one thing we're really lacking is a publicly driven process to deliver on housing. As long as we continue to live in this housing crisis and we put high ambitious goals for the state of California and for municipalities, but we still lack a direct delivery system, that's going to be a real challenge. And that's why I hope to have social housing fill that gap. But I think even under this budget, it's shown that there is this appetite to invest in our housing and really make it as a part of our infrastructure recovery package.
That's great. And Daniel, I want to bring you into the conversation, because I think, one of the newest initiatives, I think, in government innovation is some of the work that MTC and ABAG have been leading on. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about what you're thinking in terms of how to address this crisis going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Tamika. I think there's kind of two things I would put on the table. I'll touch each briefly, and then if you want to get into the details of those, we could talk more. But so the first one that comes to mind is the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, or BAFA. So it was created in 2019 by statute. And it's just really exciting. I mean, I get to work on this every day, so it's a pleasure for me to be kind of really enthusiastic and inspired in my work. It's a new regional approach to housing. I think what's so exciting about this, kind of from an innovation perspective, is that housing has typically been dealt with at a local level. We have 109 jurisdictions in the Bay Area, all trying to address housing kind of in their own separate ways. But people's lives aren't bounded by city limits. You may live in one place, work somewhere else, or have your family, down the street, but it's technically a different town. And I think, it is a regional challenge that we face. And so having an institution that can exist at a regional level to try to bring regional solutions to a regional challenge is an exciting new opportunity that we have. It's still in its infancy, which makes it exciting and kind of an opportunity, I think, for a lot of people to be involved and help shape what that could look like. But just bringing a regional lens at all, I think, really is actually an innovation in the housing space pretty significantly. The other one I'll just flag is that, that for local staff and local elected officials right now, when you talk about housing, the first thing that comes to everybody's mind is RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process, and housing element updates that have to be completed to implement that. And with some one-time funding from the state, in a prior budget cycle, we're able to launch a brand new technical assistance program to help all of our jurisdictions accomplish their goals through the housing element process. And there, some of the innovation is drawing upon efficiencies and economies of scale. We got 109 jurisdictions all doing these documents. A lot of the analysis or the methodologies used for the analysis are the same. There do need to be very specific kind of place-based, city intentionally specific policies and programs, but we can achieve economies of scale of some of the other pieces so that local staff can focus their limited time on the really difficult decisions about which parcels in your community should you be rezoning? And they can focus their time on that rather than on some things that may be a little bit more rote. So I think those are just two examples of some of the work that we're doing to try to innovate and really support the region and all of the jurisdictions within the region toward better outcomes.
I love that. And I think what's so critical is that we are really trying to focus this work on outcomes. So Senator Wiener, one of the things that I think is critical is how we think about streamlining housing development across the state. And you've really taken the charge on figuring out how to do that with SB 35. I'd love to hear about any follow-ups or other innovations around streamlining that you would like to share with folks.
Yeah, and SB 35 was the very first piece of legislation that I introduced when I was elected to the Senate, and we were able to get that through, and it's having, I think, a lot of benefits, particularly for affordable housing. In San Francisco alone, about 2,000 units of affordable housing have been streamlined under SB 35. And Bridge Housing told us about 6 months ago that because of SB 35, their average time to entitle an affordable project was reduced from 7 years to 4 months. And so it is proving to be a game changer. And there are some cities, like some bad actor cities like Cupertino, and I say that very intentionally. Cupertino is a bad actor city on housing, and shameful how they're interacting with the Balco project. They're fighting it, but a lot of cities like San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley and others are embracing SB 35 and saying, well, this makes our lives easier. We can actually get these projects entitled more quickly. We can deliver housing to our community more quickly. And so I think by and large, communities are viewing SB 35 as a help. And especially when you combine SB 35 with the density bonus and other state laws, it is a tool that cities can use. And we just saw in San Francisco, the Stanton and Haight Street, former McDonald's lot that's being turned into affordable housing. That now, there's a delay in the project, but the reason for the delay is because of the combination of SB 35 and the enhanced density bonus, they've made it into a bigger project. And so they need more money for it, which is great. We can figure that out, but it's now going to be more affordable homes. And so it's been very powerful. And I know that Arena, Daniel, I know there's a little tumult around it this year, but it's healthy tumult because we passed SB 828 a few years ago, and the intent of which was to say, let's make RENA reflect the actual world of reality. Instead of communities getting the brag that they met their RENA because they built 100 units of housing over 8 years, that's great, you met your RENA, good, that's great, but that 100 units of housing over 8 years does not reflect the actual reality of housing need. And so the purpose of that law was to say, let's make sure that these RENA allocations reflect the actual housing need. And I think they have done so. And we saw in Southern California a tripling of their RENA. In the Bay Area, it's like 2.5 times, which is not enough. I think with respectfully, HCD went too low in what it gave to the Bay Area, but it's still a significant increase. We're seeing a lot of pushback against it now, including in the legislature, there's a requested audit that I don't think there's any reason to have an audit, but other than cities being mad that they have a higher RENA allocation. And because of the higher RENA allocation, we're probably going to see more cities get streamlined under SB 35. I think we have more work to do. We're now to the point where affordable housing, supportive housing is essentially streamlined all over California and pretty much every city. I'd like to see broader streamlining for all housing, but we're getting there one step at a time.
Amen to that. Assemblymember Lee, I feel like so many of these issues are intersectional. When you're talking about housing policy, you have to also be talking about economic justice and racial justice. What are some ways that you think housing legislation can be explicitly tied to the state's need to rebuild our economy out of the impacts of COVID-19?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the clearest examples of that is this legislative session. It's a 2-year bill now. We ran a bill to address, I believe it's AB 946, is to create more home ownership opportunities by funding the Cal HFA, I believe that's the term for it. But because historically in this country and this state, we have denied communities of color, families of color, the opportunity to build wealth and to build generational wealth through homeownership. And this was a bill to correct that. And that was a bill very simply to say we were going to end the MID, mortgage interest deduction rate, on second homes, so people that had more than one home already, and transfer that over to make sure we have more room for people to have a first home. And that would hopefully obviously stimulate the economy, give more communities of color more of a chunk of the American dream. But unfortunately that bill stalled a little bit and we're still gonna be working on it, but it's important that we address very clearly intersections of this about like the economy, race, and of course housing, right? That's a very clear example of that. And another big package I see about this is, there is a big interest and there's a big emphasis from the federal, our federal partners in the White House right now about recovering through infrastructure, through building out our future, right? I think this is not a new concept, right? We've seen this certainly with the Green New Deal. We've seen this with the New Deal of almost 100 years ago, where massive public investment in infrastructure and getting people to work is the way to pull ourselves out of the economy. Back then, obviously 100 years ago, we had a literal war against fascism at that point, and that really helps things on the home front. But right now we have a war against many different crises, right? Of course, we have rising racism and white supremacy that still exists, not on the militant level of a world war, certainly, but we have the climate change crises, we have our economic crises, and those things can be addressed if we make rapid investments in our infrastructure. And I'm a big believer that housing can be the infrastructure. So instead of seeing that as oftentimes when we talk about RENA and a lot of housing things, it almost seems like a zero-sum game in traditional politics, but really it's like, how do you keep growing the pie for everyone? You get economic investments for everyone and you get homes for everyone. And what better benefit is that of a more intimate investment and benefit to people as an actual roof over their head? That's where everyone can experience it.
I couldn't agree more. Housing as infrastructure is so key to this because it also humanizes the fact that all people need a place to live. And the fact that we have commoditized housing and made that exclusive based on state sanctioned discrimination is a problem that persists. So Daniel, I want to go back to what Senator Wiener was talking about with respect to RENA goals. And we know, of course, that we now have a more realistic picture of what jurisdictions need to be doing in terms of housing. But how do we think about accountability? I feel like that's one of the Achilles heels of the state and the region in terms of holding these jurisdictions accountable for producing their share. How do you think about that?
Yeah, great question. I think the short answer, accountability doesn't lie at the regional level. So we're clean on that. No, I think, more seriously, so the existing accountability tools, so there are more accountability tools. Let me say, a lot of the legislative changes that have happened in recent years have created new mechanisms for there to be accountability. So for example, at the state level, HCD is the regulatory agency that oversees all of this. And now they have new tools at their disposal. And not only do they have tools, but HCD is seeking new resources through the budget process to actually staff up their enforcement and accountability division. So, I think this time, something we're certainly messaging to our member jurisdictions is, in the past, jurisdictions may not, in the Bay Area, all jurisdictions have had compliant housing elements, but the actual implementation of those housing element policies has been somewhat uneven, and there hasn't been a lot of consequence for that. I think we're looking at a very different environment now. Where we see the state much more willing and interested in pursuing consequences for jurisdictions that the state doesn't believe are meeting their obligations, and they're resourcing themselves up to actually sue jurisdictions, impose fines on jurisdictions. And I know the state never wants to do that if they could give a carrot instead, but they now have a stick. Other opportunities, I think, align with the streamlining conversation that kind of Senator Wiener brought up, which is to say, if jurisdictions aren't meeting, the combination of the increased RENA numbers plus streamlining bills like SB 35, in a number of years, we could see a dramatically different entitlement process in the Bay Area. If jurisdictions are not hitting the numbers, we could have pretty significant, I would say like almost seismic shifts in the ability to get projects entitled across, I think, the affordability spectrum. Just because of the way that SB 35 works. So I think that there are also those kind of mechanisms now that, again, when we're talking to jurisdictions, we're trying to really emphasize that if housing elements in prior cycles were the kind of thing you could blow off, that is, you could get in deep trouble if you take that approach moving forward.
Yeah. Agreed. I think that's really key, and that time savings is so critical. If we're really going to be meeting people where they are in their housing crisis, we need to be acting much more quickly than we're used to. So, Assemblymember Lee and Senator Wiener, question for both of you. Many of us are incredibly concerned about the looming eviction moratorium expiring on June 30th with SB 91. And really concerned that we have not yet hit a place where the recovery is is in fact happening for our most vulnerable workers and tenants. And so I wanted to hear from you how you all are thinking about the extending the eviction moratorium and tenant protections as we muddle our way through this recovery. Would love your thoughts on that.
Well, I'd like to see it extended. I mean, we tried to make it for longer when we reauthorized it in January, and the compromise was to end it June 30th. I think there is a desire among a number of us to extend it to later in the year. I don't have a sense yet about the desire of the governor and leadership on that yet. I haven't sensed any momentum at this point, but we do have another month to get that done. It would be done through the budget, which means it can be done quickly, even if it's just like a 2 or 3 month extension of the existing structure, which is very simple and clean to do. The existing structure is not perfect by any stretch, but we're now making changes to some of the rent relief programs to make it more flexible, which is good. So I feel like we need to add some more time at least to allow that to play out and to work.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with Senator Wiener here. I mean, I of course want to see the eviction moratorium extended as long as possible, because we know even if the immediate health crisis tapers out on June 15th, I don't say it will be ending, but it will be taper out for the most part, I think, as we get closer to herd immunity, which we still are not all the way there yet. It will be difficult, I think. The governor proposed more money to put into rental relief, right? And he announced very enthusiastically, but there was an LA Times article that just came out that said only 30% of the money had even been requested. And that means there's billions of dollars on the table. And I think we know, at least anecdotally and from our own experience, that this program was always going to be a rough patch. I even have cases in my constituency where, sometimes it just ends up that landlords would prefer not to keep pushing this deadline, or keep pushing this thing going. And sometimes I get these stories about like, oh, my tenant didn't apply for this thing, so I'm thinking about kicking them out right after the thing. And I'm like, you can apply, you can do this, it's within your power, and it's actually advantageous under the current system to do so. But I think there's a lot of resistance for a lot of different reasons, unfortunately. So as we continue to beef up our hopeful rent relief packages, we also have to be mindful that while the more opt-in it is, the more difficult it is for people, especially who are under-resourced, and those who traditionally left out are going to remain left out. And that was one thing I quite feared with this package. And it's our work in the community to constantly spread the word and say, look, you can actually get your money back, especially now that the new proposal, if approved by the legislature, is 100% rent relief. That I think will smooth the pot for a lot of people, because I know some people were quite upset that even leaving 20% on the table was not good enough. So hopefully that will be enough. But I do think that the secondary effects of the pandemic on our housing market and displacement are going to be felt for a long time, even after June 30th.
Absolutely. And I know we're getting to the point where I want to open it up for audience questions. And Senator Wiener, I know you have a hard stop. One last question for you and any of the panelists before we open it up. What do you need from us to help you win on these issues? I mean, there feels like there are persistent and perennial barriers that prevent us from moving into the place where we need to move to. What advice do you have from us, and what do you need from us in order to advance some of these goals?
Well, I think more people around the state need to be advocating to their legislators. We know from polling that housing is not controversial in California. As much heat as there was last year and last couple of years around SB 50, for example, there were 3 statewide polls done on SB 50, supposedly the most controversial and politically toxic bill, whatever, all the hyperbole around. 3 different statewide polls done, asking the question about SB 50 a little bit differently each time. It didn't matter how you asked the question. It polled in the 60s. Every region Los Angeles, where we only got 1 out of 10 LA senators to vote for because it was supposedly so politically toxic there. LA polled in the 60s. It polls, housing production, including questions like, do you want multi-unit construction in your neighborhood? Things like that. Very blunt questions. Polls higher among young people, but polls high among older people, higher among communities of color, but high among white people too, higher among renters, but high among homeowners too. It is not controversial in California to advocate to build more housing. It's not controversial to advocate to build more affordable housing for low-income people. It's not, none of these things are controversial among people, but we have a self-selecting, unrepresented group of privileged people with a lot of time on their hand who are disproportionately white, who are disproportionately homeowners, who are disproportionately older, who have the time to harangue their legislators, to show up at every town hall and every community meeting and every planning commission meeting, and to yell and scream and carry on about how if you put a duplex in my neighborhood, it's going to be the end of the world, and just being very melodramatic. And I know a drama queen when I see a drama queen, and these people are drama queens, and they're very, very good at it. But they don't represent a majority. And so but for legislators, there's always, for all of us in elected office, there's a psychological impact if the only people you're hearing from are from one side, even if they don't represent a majority. And so we need people who are pro-housing, all forms of housing, to become much more consistently engaged, to show up at neighborhood meetings, to show up at town halls, to call even if they agree, even if they just like what the legislator is doing, to call to say, I support what you're doing, because they're getting beaten up by the other side. We have to get much better at that. And the YIMBY movement has really mobilized a lot of people around that, but I think we need an even broader mobilization.
That's great. What about you, Assemblymember Lee?
I couldn't put it better myself. We need to hear your voices consistently in support and help us craft these proposals to overcome the drama queens.
Put simply. All right. Well, let me pull some questions from our audience. How would the panelists respond to concerns that the necessary infrastructure is not being built or funded to support the RHNA numbers? Daniel, or Scott, I don't know if you're
yeah, I'm happy to start off since I have to jump off in a few minutes, unfortunately. Okay. And this is an article that I'm going to be honest, this like drives me to distraction a little bit. I'm all for infrastructure. We all are. I have been a huge supporter of infrastructure back to my time on the Board of Supervisors. I've led bond campaigns. We need to be doing so much more for our transit systems, for our schools, for our water systems, our sewer systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We need more infrastructure. We need more housing. The two can never be conditioned on each other, or neither will ever happen. And the idea, and we hear this from a lot of opponents of housing, well, you can't build the housing until we perfect the infrastructure. Well, then it's never going to get built. The two, they move forward together, but it's never in perfect tandem. And when you look how modern community or how cities have evolved in the US, people move there. The job one is to make sure that people who, as the city grows, people aren't having to live in dumpsters and they can actually live in homes. So you build the homes, and then the infrastructure catches up because there's demand for it, and it's never perfect. But the idea that people are not entitled to have housing until there's perfect infrastructure is an immoral argument. And I think people need to be called out when they make that argument. They're not intentionally being immoral. It is an immoral argument, because what are they saying? You get to sleep in a dumpster or get to commute 2 hours to work until we get around to perfecting our infrastructure. That is not an okay argument to make. The two cannot be tied together.
I'd love all of you to respond to this question.
I'll just say, in a way, obviously, I think a lot of it is also kind of this obstructionism we see when it comes to adaptations or growth. The question is, or its simple fact is, people will always want to live in California, always want to live in the area we have, and certainly until climate disaster destroys the state or something. But certainly people want to be able to live here. And I think you have the same kind of almost Victorian era, there are too many people in the world in that kind of sense. There are too many people that can use all the resources. So you see them manifested in the infrastructure debates, whether it be garbage, water, or transportation, or traffic even, right? So you have these kind of modern manifestations of the overpopulation myth. And I frankly think that's just, sometimes it can be compelling to someone who's not too well versed in it or doesn't know too much. It could be compelling on its surface, but they are, I think, legitimized ways to just deny our communities from getting more diverse, from growing and adapting to growth. And it's the same kind of rhetoric that, like again, said, has been around for centuries.
I'm differently situated than my other panelists here, so I think what I would say is what I could add to the conversation is I think that I appreciate, Senator Wiener, your point that they should not be conditioned on each other. I think an opportunity for innovation is finding ways of pairing them together so that the legitimate infrastructure needs can be addressed, and to also minimize any kind of either disingenuous or misinformed use of that argument. So one example of what that could look like, for example, is in BAFA's founding statute, AB 1487. If BAFA were to run a regional ballot measure, up to 10% of the ballot measure, 90% of it would have to go to housing-related services across the 3 Ps, but up to 10% could be used as a flexible pool. One of the eligible expenditures there is infrastructure. And so if, governing boards decided that they wanted to, they could actually pair housing dollars with infrastructure dollars. And that may be a way both of addressing those concerns, but also securing approvals, because that argument would no longer carry water. So, I think that conditioning may not be the right approach, but some sort of pairing when possible to make sure that those investments are aligning in a way that kind of facilitates the sensible progression of both.
Yeah, and just to be clear, and sorry, my voice is wrestling in my throat. And to be clear, I'm all in favor of trying to pair them to the extent it's possible. Clearly, as you grow, you want to, improve your infrastructure, but it's the conditioning. And one thing I will say is that as we try to pair them, we have to be careful not to keep being so reliant on impact fees. Impact fees, I support reasonable impact fees, but in fairness, we put cities in a position where we make it so hard for them to raise revenue. The easiest way to do it is just to do impact fees, and that makes housing more expensive. And so we have to be better about, being able to go to the ballot, create pools of infrastructure, pass the Biden infrastructure plan, and so on and so forth. And I apologize, I have to run. Thank you, everyone, for all your work and for having me today.
Thanks for joining us. Great to see you.
Great. Thank you. Bye, Assemblyman.
All right.
Yeah,
Another question from the audience about ending single-family zoning and what the role is at the state or regional level, as evidenced by a couple of cities across the country. How are you all thinking about if that were a policy decision that we made?
So I'll say really quickly, and I do have to hop at 45 as well. I apologize. I support getting rid of single-family zoning. It does not mean to get rid of single-family homes. It just means we're ending an exclusionary practice saying this piece of land or this swaths of land can only have this use and this type of building. I think often to how, a lot of members of my community, they dream of going on vacation or living in other places like in Europe and Asia where the housing stock and the housing neighborhoods are very, very different, right? Vibrant, small neighborhoods where they can only be two stories tall or something, but we have outlawed a lot of those kind of communities that people love. Communities like this pre-World War II that are now very, very rare. But I think also you can see them more in the East Bay and Sacramento often sometimes too. But I think in the American paradigm sometimes of housing and politics, we either think you get cookie cutter suburbs or you live in a box in the sky, a concrete box in the sky. And that is not true. In the entire swath of human history and city development, there are so many different ways you can live. And I think the rhetoric around, having a duplex or triplex in your neighborhood, which I'll be granted, I live in transit quarter next to duplexes too, so it's not like insanity that people propose it to be. But I think there's this idea that, unfortunately, because of how our politics of land use has become in this country, where you can only have that dichotomy, right? You can either have your castle in the suburbs, or you will be relegated to a prison in the sky, and that's not the case. If we are able to end exclusionary zoning and single family housing zoning, which can only say one thing, you could have a neighborhood where you have 3 homes on the same acreage and you wouldn't even know it. You could barely know it, right? But I think that's the way to do it. And we have to frankly take on these scary myths out there and say, well, actually, that's not true. It doesn't actually take away your piece of the American dream. It just says your neighbor or someone down the street from you or someone on the other side of the state could now have a nice home that accommodates their needs, the right size, right forms, and all that stuff. But it's also important, I think, as we go forward in that, to also not just say in the eventuality we end exclusionary zoning, not to just replicate the same constraints by other laws, right? Other states and other cities have had successes getting rid of the blanket ban, but sometimes, in effect, they could still be upheld. We don't want that to be the case either.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is so well taken that we have sort of this false dichotomy that it's one or the other. And what you're saying is really there's so many different ways to think about density that allows people to have a living experience that they can be comfortable with. How do we break up that paradigm? Because I feel like that's our work. I mean, the mental models of how people perceive what is, our land use ends of each spectrum are pretty fixed. How do we break it up?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in that, especially when it comes to our housing paradigm and the culture around it. People really have to see it, feel it, touch it, and understand it. So in our work on doing social housing, when the pandemic is over, finally, we will hopefully do trips and a lot more showing and telling of like, this is what social housing looks like in Singapore. This is what it looks like in the United Kingdom or other places, because we all come at housing with certain perceptions, right? Based on our own lived experiences, based on what we know in the media. And just in the case of social housing, we don't want everyone to think of Pruitt-Igoe or something like that. That is a part of the story, but it's not representative of the entire sample. Same thing with our housing stock, right? I would love to be able to take people to, even in my district, there's a lot of innovative little nooks and crannies that you didn't even know. They're like bungalow courts, cottage, I don't remember the name, cottage kind of style housing, ranch style homes. All this exists. And I was fortunate to actually know a lot of these personally because I did a lot of door knocking in my campaign. So it's like I know where all these little spots are and they're tucked away. But when people realize that there are more options out there and they see it with their own eyes and they can feel what it looks like, then I think that changes people's minds. So I am fortunate a lot of, I think, the great organizations on here actually also do the additional work of like showing people examples so they don't, when we have people who protest and say this kind of housing will destroy the neighborhood, we say, well, you know what, let's go show you an example of what this looks like somewhere else or somewhere nearby and see how it works. The greatest thing I love to show people are like, maybe this is just my bias, but I love the brick and terrace houses of the United Kingdom where they are essentially single family homes as you colloquially will think about them, but they're smaller, they're compact, they're manageable, they're walkable, everything is beautiful, and they're desired, right? People want to be able to have those kind of homes. So that's just the way we do it. And I think it's just about like showing people more, showing versus telling.
Yeah, seeing is believing. I was seeing in the chat that Gabby is saying there's going to be a follow-up event on social housing next week, which I think will be really exciting because there was a question about how does social housing compare to the affordable housing system and what would need to be adapted if we were going to go more in that direction. So really excited about
for
that.
Next week then, I guess, right?
Yeah, I guess so. All right. So one last question for you, Daniel. I know Assemblyman member Lee, you have to run as well. There was a question, Daniel, from the audience about how do we put more teeth in enforcing RHNA? What is needed to really make bolster that accountability that we referred to earlier?
Yeah, good question. I think some of it, I do think there are more teeth now. I want to like keep reiterating that. Like, there have been a lot of changes in the law, and we are entering into a new cycle where we're going to see how effective those are. So I do think that just, one thing that's helpful that I think all of you who are here today are kind of a part of this is just monitoring. having people in the community who actually know the community, checking up on the numbers, checking up on kind of what's going on in your community, and you can be a line of accountability. Another way of putting that perhaps is just to say you're a part of this, right? Like local housing plans are owned or should be owned by the people in those communities. And so, actually like making sure that those visions are coming to fruition, I think should be something that all of us can take on. And HCD is now tracking this a lot more carefully. There are a lot of new reporting requirements that have to be undertaken. I think the chat was kind of asking like, oh, cities are reporting units that may get entitled, but they're not getting built, kind of what's going on there. And some of it is that the numbers used to be based on entitlements or building permits, et cetera. But now HCD is requiring jurisdictions to submit information every time a project is proposed, when it's entitled, when there's a building permit, and when there's a certificate of occupancy. You see the full spectrum. And I think in a number of years, the kind of analysis we're going to be able to do with this body of data is going to be phenomenal. Like we'll be able to know in which communities are we getting to entitlement, but not, certificate of occupancy. What's going on there? Or in which, where are we seeing there the longest delays to even get to a building permit? And what's going on there, and how can we tailor approaches? So I think we're going to get a lot more tools in our toolbox. And I know Assemblymember Lee just left, but I want to just, it stuck with me, his little metaphor. You either get your castle or prison in the sky. I love it. The way you were describing that dichotomy, I just want to lift up his imagery there as being really powerful to describe that dichotomy.
I think that's a perfect way for us to wrap up this discussion. Daniel, thank you so much for being a part of it. Thank you, Senator Wiener and Assemblymember Lee. It's been my pleasure to moderate this conversation, and thank you to SB at Home for hosting such dynamic conversations during Affordable Housing Month. I'm going to turn it back over to David to wrap us up. Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Tamika, for being our amazing moderator. And thank you so much to the panelists. My name is David Meyer with Silicon Valley at Home. We are just gonna, before we close out, a couple quick things that we would love to hear from you. We are gonna do a quick poll to get your feedback on today's event. And that's gonna pop up, oh, there it is. We're gonna give you guys a couple seconds to make four clicks. And I think we got responses coming in. So thank you very much, everyone, for providing those responses. And two quick things before we go. First of all, as was alluded to earlier, there are many more great events coming up for Affordable Housing Month. Two of them that we wanted to highlight is our next week. We have our legislative update on May 27th at 2 p.m. featuring the wonderful speakers we have here on screen. There's going to be a registration link put in the chat so that you can register. We are also going to be having on the 28th at noon, so next Friday at noon, our May Housing Action Coalition meeting, where we're going to have a debrief discussion of Richard Rothstein's talk that occurred, wait, now it was 2 weeks ago, or no, that was last week, which you can also view on our website. We have the video of that great event posted, so you can check that out. We're gonna be having a conversation with community members, with everyone, getting together and having opportunities to talk about what we learned from that discussion and talk about actions that we can take. So there's also all kinds of other Affordable Housing Month events coming up. There's a full calendar, which I think is also going to put in the chat, so you can check out. I know the social housing event next week was already highlighted, so there's still a lot of great events to come in the next week. And then just one last thing before we go, we want to say one last thank you to our sponsors, and we have a small video that we want to share so you can hear from them about why they support affordable housing and Affordable Housing Month.
The average life expectancy for individuals experiencing homelessness is 25 years less than for people who are stably housed. This statistic is one of the reasons the Health Trust prioritizes health in housing.
Until we fix the housing instability that so many in our communities face, we will not have a community that is sustainable in the future, where we all want to live, one that is whole.
I'm passionate about advocating for housing because it is critical to both our collective and individual success. We need local housing solutions so we can generate broad-based economic growth, reduce commutes, and generate prosperity for everyone.
For me personally, and for the work we're doing at Urban Catalyst, providing more housing solutions for all levels of income is vital to the success of the community.
Hi, my name is Lenny Gutierrez, and I work for Comcast. We are excited to be sponsors for the first time of SV at Home's Affordable Housing Month. We know how important it is for there to be affordable housing, and just as importantly, how important it is to have affordable broadband at home.
I am hopeful that we can solve housing instability, because working at Destination Home, I see the passion and drive of my colleagues and partners every single day. As part of our Housing Ready Communities work, I see clear and abundant desire among neighbors and community members to help, learn, and get involved.
Hi, I'm Patty with Habitat for Humanity, East Bay, Silicon Valley. And yes, I feel hopeful even in the midst of this housing crisis. A community of engaged, impassioned people that are willing to do something about affordable housing can have that kind of impact.
At HealthNet, we believe every person deserves a safety net for their health, regardless of age, income, employment status, or current state of health. We understand how important housing is to the health of an individual, especially for one's physical and mental health. And that's why we're excited to be sponsors for this year's SV at Home Affordable Housing Month.
Palo Alto Forward supports expanding the supply of housing that's really affordable to low and moderate income residents. We do that because it helps equity, the environment, and the economy.
Hi, I'm Candice Gonzalez. On behalf of Sandhill Property Company, we are happy to support SV at Home's Affordable Housing Month. We believe that housing should be a right, and we believe in housing for all.
At Applied Materials, we believe that everyone deserves access to safe and affordable housing. But we know that this simply isn't the reality right now in our community. Through activities and engagement like Affordable Housing Month, individuals in our community have the opportunity to dive deeper into the issues that cause the inequities in Silicon Valley, as well as really focus on the solutions.
Facebook's been in the housing space for several years now. In 2019, we made our $1 billion commitment to increase housing affordability and launched our first fund out of that commitment. I want to thank SV at Home for putting on such a stellar lineup again this year. I'm really looking forward to the events and the critical conversations that we need to have about how to increase housing opportunity for all.
So thank you again to everyone. We actually are inviting you all to participate in sharing your own videos as part of this project, sharing why affordable housing is important to you. So there is a link that's shared here, there it is, that Gabby just put for hope.xyz, where you can record your own video and share your perspectives and join us in that way. So it's easy as one click. Be done right in your browser, and it only takes a minute, as Gabby said. So thank you again to our panelists and our moderator for a great discussion, and happy Affordable Housing Month, and we look forward to seeing you at more events. So thank you.